It sounds sexy, it sounds cool, but it's expensive. It's a pain in the neck. If you have property in Spain or France or Germany, guess what? You need to do planning in those countries. We had a client who just chose not to do that in spite of our counsel for many, many years, and then they got caught. And the penalties and the interest were savage. The value of those assets were just ravaged as a consequence. Hi, this is Rick Durfee. We're going to talk a few minutes about offshore assets and offshore estate planning and asset protection. This is something that comes up a lot these days, increasingly, whether they want to do offshore planning or not. People still own stuff that's not inside the U.S. So how do we deal with that? Do I have to go have an offshore plan or an offshore entity? And sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes the answer is no. And the important thing is you need to get qualified advice so that you know what to do with it. So as an example, having an account, an investment account outside the U.S. does not always require you to have a non-U.S. entity. That offshore account can be held by a U.S. entity, by a U.S. LLC or a U.S. trust. And sometimes that's a way that people venture into offshore planning. Well, I want to have an offshore bank account or an investment account. Great. Let's help you do that. We have a lot of advisors that do that, so we can help you connect with people who do that and that we have confidence in because we've worked with them a lot of times with a lot of high net worth people. So we can help you figure that out. So you can open up an offshore account and have that owned by your domestic U.S. trust or by your domestic U.S. entity. Using a domestic entity is also a way to kind of pull an offshore asset into the U.S. For example, here in Arizona, we live close to the Mexican border. Lots of people buy properties in Mexico, which is awesome. And it used to be that you could never get bank financing on Mexico assets because they're in Mexico. And then some clever guy figured out a couple of decades ago that you could form a U.S. LLC that could own that property in Mexico. And then the bank said, hey, if it's owned by a U.S. LLC, we'll finance it. So that, by the way, jacked the prices of some of those Mexican properties way up, which is not surprising. You create more demand, you make the easier to buy it because we can get financing, the price goes up. But now that Mexico asset is owned by a U.S. LLC, and that U.S. LLC can be, by the way, captured by a bank on a financing thing. It can be transferred among individuals. It can be bought and sold. It can be incorporated into your U.S. trust and integrated into your estate plan so your children or beneficiaries inherit that under your trust. Now, when should I consider going offshore? When do I need to have a trust or an LLC in Nevis Islands or a bank account in Belize or whatever? That's a complicated question. And I will tell you, we help clients do offshore asset protection. But for every one we take offshore, we bring about 3 back because it sounds sexy, it sounds cool, but it's expensive. It's a pain in the neck. And often we can get the same protection, maybe even better protection, by doing domestic planning and having domestic entities that own offshore accounts. So we kind of have a hybrid between the two. But let's just say you're here in the U.S., for example, and you own property in Canada. That's a common thing, another common thing that we run into all the time. Most of the time, your U.S. estate plan is really only going to deal with your U.S. assets. And so you will need to have other planning in whatever that other jurisdiction is, Canada or Mexico or wherever. It's important to note that sometimes, as we've discussed, you can have a U.S. entity own that offshore asset, and it has the effect of kind of a hybrid, bringing it into the U.S. so your U.S. documents control. But there are a number of jurisdictions, for example, that are not very favorable to or accommodating of a U.S. trust. Trusts, by the way, have been creatures of English common law. So traditional enemies of England, even if they're not enemies today, but they were historically, they generally do not recognize and will not work with a U.S. trust. So if you have property in Spain or France or Germany, guess what? You need to do planning in those countries separate from what you do in the U.S. And you're probably going to need appropriate legal counsel and advice in that country that a U.S. attorney just cannot do. So when is it good to do offshore planning? Well, if you have assets offshore, if you have family offshore, if you go there, if you have a reason to be there, that's when we see that it works best. But if you live in your zip code and you've rarely gone out of it and you're going to stay in your zip code and your family and your assets are in your zip code, offshore planning is probably not for you. We can get you good enough, maybe even better asset protection with domestic solutions that don't require you to go there. So these are some kind of introductory thoughts to offshore planning. Be aware of it. When you go visit with your advisors and you're doing estate planning, they need to know about those assets. It blows my mind when I meet with clients that have been our clients for years and years and years, and they go, "Oh, by the way, I have this thing over there in some other country, and I never told you about it." It's also important, by the way, if you're going to do offshore planning, that you've got to do the FATCA and the FBAR disclosures on your tax returns. I can tell you we had a client who just chose not to do that in spite of our counsel for many, many years, and then they got caught. And the penalties and the interest were savage. The value of those assets were just ravaged as a consequence. So don't try and use offshore as a way to cheat or hide. It doesn't work. You've got to comply with the law so that FATCA and FBAR reports, those are very specific things that have to be done with your tax reporting. You've got to do that with your offshore assets. We help clients guide through this. If this is something that you need to get some questions answered, give us a holler. Please put things in the comment bar. We try to be aware of those and respond to those. If you like this, if this was helpful, let us know. Do all the things that everybody else tells you to do with these things. Come back and see more. We have a lot of stuff we like to help people understand. We're taking on new clients. We'd love to work with you. And if you're not going to work with us, find somebody else who can help you and give you the kind of counsel that you need.